The icy expanse of Zeltheron 7 stretched endlessly, a desolate white desert under a bleak, steel-gray sky. Wind howled like a chorus of tortured spirits, whipping through the canyons and flinging shards of ice against the waiting cadets. They stood in a tight cluster, shivering despite their thermal suits and heat generators, their breaths fogging the air like tiny clouds of desperation. The Galactic Academy's ice trial was infamous throughout the galaxy, a test that no cadet had ever passed without severe injury or retreat. Many considered it an impossible challenge, a cruel gauntlet meant to break even the strongest of minds and bodies. Eli Morin stood slightly apart from the others, his expression calm and unreadable. He wore a simple set of thermal clothing, layered with fleece and windbreaker material, a stark contrast to the heavily armored suits worn by the other cadets. His dark brown hair was tucked under a woolen beanie, and his blue eyes scanned the horizon with quiet intensity. Slung over one shoulder was a bulky, ragged backpack stuffed with seemingly random items. Scraps of metal, bundles of cord, and a dented metal flask clinking against a small cast-iron pot. The other cadets eyed him with a mix of confusion and disdain, their sneers barely hidden behind frost-encrusted visors. Standing at the forefront of the group was Captain Xylor, a towering, muscular figure with skin like blue stone and eyes that gleamed like polished silver. He raised a gloved hand, and the wind seemed to still for a moment as he addressed the gathered cadets. His voice boomed, echoing through the icy canyon. "This is the ultimate test of endurance and survival," Captain Xylor announced, his gaze sweeping over the cadets. "For the next 48 hours, you will be left to your own devices. You may use any resources you find within the ice plains. You may build, hunt, or scavenge as you see fit. However, you will receive no external assistance. The storm will worsen as the trial progresses, and temperatures will drop to lethal levels. Anyone who cannot endure may request evacuation, but doing so will mean instant failure." A low murmur rippled through the group as the cadets exchanged uneasy glances. Each species had its own methods of surviving harsh environments. The Lithorans, whose skin could harden into crystalline armor, began muttering among themselves, their leader examining a handheld thermal generator. The Xurians, thin and spindly with iridescent scales, activated their cloaking devices, hoping to trap body heat more efficiently. The Orlok, bulky and covered in dense fur, simply bared their sharp teeth and laughed, exhaling steam into the frozen air. But Eli stood apart, silent and focused. Captain Xylor's gaze fell on him, lingering for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. A smirk twisted his stony lips. "Human," Xylor said, his tone mocking. "What do you think you're going to do with that primitive gear? Build a snowman?" A few cadets snickered, their laughter sharp and brittle against the howling wind. Eli's expression remained neutral. He tightened the straps on his backpack and said nothing. There was no point in explaining himself to them. Instead, he turned and began walking away from the group, his boots crunching through the frozen ground. The other cadets watched him go, their eyes following him with a mixture of pity and derision. "He's dead in an hour," one Lithoran muttered, shaking his head. "The human species isn't built for this." But Eli kept walking, his breath fogging the air as he moved deeper into the ice plains. The cold bit through his clothing, numbing his fingers and seeping into his bones. But he pressed on, each step deliberate and unhurried. The terrain was treacherous, a labyrinth of frozen ridges and snowdrifts that rose like jagged teeth from the ground. Wind gusts pelted him with shards of ice, each sting a reminder that he was not welcome here. After nearly an hour of walking, Eli reached a shallow depression in the ice, partially shielded from the wind by a natural rock outcropping. He dropped his backpack and crouched, his hands trembling as he unzipped the main compartment. From within, he pulled out a tattered, water-resistant map and unfolded it against the rock. His eyes traced the contours of the terrain, searching for the small marker he had memorized during the Academy's briefing. "There," he murmured, his breath puffing white. "Moss veins." The map indicated a network of underground thermal springs, pockets of warmth trapped beneath the ice that sometimes reached the surface through thin cracks. If he could locate even one of those cracks, he might have a chance. He stuffed the map back into his backpack, grabbed a small pickaxe fashioned from salvaged metal, and began to dig. The work was slow and exhausting. The ice was dense, harder than stone, and every strike sent shockwaves up his arms. Eli gritted his teeth, his jaw clenched against the cold, and kept chipping away. After what felt like hours, his pickaxe struck something softer, a patch of grayish moss growing in a fissure in the ice. His heart raced as he dropped to his knees and peered into the crack. Warm air wafted up, carrying the faint. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Eli worked quickly, prying loose chunks of ice and using them to form a rudimentary wall around the fissure, trapping the rising warmth. Then he pulled out the small pot from his backpack and placed it over the crack, allowing the heat to slowly melt a handful of snow he had collected. As the ice turned to water, Eli removed the dented flask and poured the liquid into it, setting it aside to cool. While the water melted, Eli began gathering larger chunks of ice, using his pickaxe to carve them into blocks. The work was backbreaking, his muscles aching from the effort, but he persisted. 1 block, 2, 3. Slowly but steadily he began to stack them in a circular formation, each block angled slightly inward to form a dome. His breath misted the air, his fingers stinging as he packed snow into the gaps, sealing each joint to prevent the wind from seeping through. Hours passed. The light dimmed as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ice plains. The temperature dropped further, the wind biting with renewed ferocity. Inside his half-built igloo, Eli lit a small fire, using dried moss and a sliver of metal he had sharpened into a makeshift blade. The heat filled the enclosed space, and the temperature rose just enough to keep him from freezing. Outside, the wind howled like a beast, slamming against the igloo walls. Eli huddled close to the fire, his hands wrapped around the flask. The water inside had finally cooled enough to drink. He took a slow, careful sip, the warmth flooding his throat and spreading through his chest. For a moment, he allowed himself to close his eyes, to breathe, to savor the warmth. But the moment passed quickly. There were still 40 hours to go, and Eli knew that the real storm was just beginning. The wind outside the igloo howled like a wounded beast, its ferocity shaking the fragile walls Eli had painstakingly constructed. Inside, the temperature remained just above freezing, the small fire crackling as it ate through the last scraps of dried moss. Eli's hands hovered over the flames, his fingertips red and raw from the cold. Every breath sent a plume of white mist into the dim space, the only light coming from the flickering flames. He stared into the fire, his mind churning with calculations. The storm outside was growing stronger, the wind pushing snow against the igloo in waves. It wouldn't hold for long. The structure was too small, the ice blocks hastily packed, the seams not fully sealed. Eli knew he would have to reinforce it before the worst of the storm hit. But first, he needed more materials. He stood, bracing himself against the low ceiling, and reached for the battered backpack. From inside, he pulled out the small, dented pot and his metal flask. The water he had melted earlier had cooled completely, and he drank it down in slow, measured sips, feeling the warmth slide down his throat and settle in his belly. Every drop mattered. The thermal springs were his only source of heat and water, and he couldn't afford to waste a single ounce. Outside, the wind screamed, carrying with it distant voices. Eli's head snapped up. The voices were muffled, fragmented by the storm, but they were unmistakably alien. He pressed his ear to the igloo wall, straining to hear. Stew, malfunction, temp dropping, lost. Signal, need, extraction. Coordinates, offline. Eli's jaw clenched. The other cadets were already in trouble. It hadn't even been a full day, and the first casualties were already being logged. He could picture them now. Orlocks huddled together in their fur-covered suits, Lithorans struggling to keep their crystalline armor from cracking under the sub-zero temperatures, Xerians desperately trying to keep their cloaking devices operational to trap heat. They had come prepared with all the tech and gadgets the Galactic Academy had provided, but the storm was proving to be more than their technology could handle. Eli crouched by the fire, his eyes narrowed in thought. The igloo was stable for now, but it wouldn't withstand another round of wind gusts. He needed to reinforce it, make it more durable, more insulated. And he needed to gather more moss to keep the fire burning. Without it, the temperature inside would drop to lethal levels. Taking a deep breath, Eli pulled on his mittens, wrapped his scarf around his neck, and slid the pickaxe through a loop in his belt. He unzipped the entrance to the igloo, wincing as the icy wind blasted his face, cutting through the layers of fabric like a knife. The air was colder than before, the wind carrying tiny shards of ice that stung his exposed skin. The landscape was a white wasteland. Snow swirled in chaotic patterns, obscuring visibility beyond a few feet. Eli squinted, trying to locate the rock outcropping where he had found the thermal fissure. It was barely visible through the snow, a dark smudge against the blinding white. He moved forward, his boots sinking into the snow with every step. The wind fought against him, threatening to knock him off balance, but he pressed on, his teeth gritted against the cold. When he reached the fissure, he dropped to his knees, peering into the crack. Warm air still seeped through, though it was weaker now, the fissure partially blocked by accumulating snow. Eli pulled out the pickaxe and began chipping away at the ice, widening the crack to allow more warmth to escape. His muscles burned with the effort, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but he kept going until the fissure was open enough to place the pot inside. He packed the edges of the fissure with snow, creating a barrier to trap the heat, then placed the pot inside, allowing it to slowly melt the snow he had collected earlier. As he worked, the voices drifted through the wind again, louder this time. Put up a fire pit, request. Extraction. Unable to move, frostbite setting in, Eli clenched his jaw, his hands tightening around the handle of the pickaxe. The cadets were scattered across the ice plains, separated by kilometers of deadly terrain. If they were calling for extraction now, it meant they were in serious trouble, but extraction meant failure. No one would pass the ice trial if they called for help. Eli shook his head, refocusing on the task at hand. He needed more moss. Without fuel, his fire would die, and once the fire was gone, the igloo would become a frozen tomb. He moved away from the fissure, his eyes scanning the ground for patches of grayish moss. It grew sporadically across the ice plains, clinging to rocks and crevices where geothermal heat occasionally surfaced. After several minutes of searching, he spotted a cluster of moss growing along the base of a rock. He knelt down, using the pickaxe to gently pry the moss loose, collecting it in his backpack. The moss was damp, but once dried it would burn steadily. Eli worked quickly, his fingers numb despite the mittens. The wind was growing stronger, the snow falling thicker now, obscuring the horizon. As he stuffed the last handful of moss into his backpack, another sound reached his ears, a muffled, agonized scream. Eli's heart leaped into his throat. The sound was close, much closer than the previous voices. He turned, his eyes scanning the landscape, searching for the source. The snow shifted, the wind howling louder, and then he saw it. A figure stumbling through the snow, arms flailing, legs barely holding him up. It was a Lithoran cadet. His crystalline armor was cracked and splintered, blood seeping from a jagged wound along his side. He staggered forward, his eyes wild with panic, his lips blue from the cold. Eli dropped the pickaxe and sprinted toward him, his boots pounding against the frozen ground. "Hey!" Eli shouted, his voice barely carrying over the wind. "Hey, over here!" The Lithoran's eyes flicked toward Eli, but he barely reacted. His legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed into the snow, his body convulsing as the wind battered him. Eli reached him just as his eyes started to close, his breaths coming in weak, shallow pants. "Stay with me," Eli said, kneeling beside the Lithoran. "You're going to be okay." The Lithoran's eyes fluttered, his cracked lips moving soundlessly. Eli slipped his arms under the Lithoran's shoulders, heaving him up with a grunt of effort. The cadet was heavy, his crystalline skin dense and unyielding, but Eli dragged him through the snow, every step a battle against the wind. The igloo loomed ahead, a small dome of packed ice barely visible through the storm. When they finally reached the entrance, Eli dropped to his knees, pulling the Lithoran inside. The cadet's skin was like ice, his breaths ragged and shallow. Eli unwrapped his own scarf, pressing it against the cadet's wound to staunch the bleeding. Blood seeped through the fabric, staining the white cloth a deep, dark blue. Eli pulled the pot from the fissure, the water inside warm but not boiling. He poured it into his flask and held it to the Lithoran's lips, tipping it gently to let a few drops slide down his throat. The cadet swallowed weakly, his eyes drifting closed. Eli placed the flask aside, his mind racing. The storm was worsening, and the igloo wouldn't last another night without reinforcement. And now, he had another life to protect. Eli took a deep breath, his eyes hardening as he pulled out the pickaxe once more. The next step was clear. Reinforce the igloo. Build it stronger, keep the fire burning, and make sure neither of them froze to death before morning. Inside the igloo, the temperature was barely tolerable. The Lithoran cadet lay against the icy wall, his crystalline skin glistening with a sheen of melting frost. His breaths were shallow and uneven, his eyes half closed, flickering between consciousness and the dark abyss of hypothermia. The wound along his side had stopped bleeding, but the blue-stained scarf wrapped around his torso was now frozen stiff. Eli crouched beside him, his brow furrowed as he watched the cadet's chest rise and fall in labored gasps. The fire in the center of the igloo sputtered, the flames licking weakly at the last clumps of dried moss Eli had collected. It was the only source of warmth in the frozen chamber, and it was dying. Eli's jaw tightened. Without the fire, the temperature would drop drastically. The Lithoran would not survive another hour in the cold, and Eli himself wasn't much better off. Eli rose to his feet, his legs aching from exhaustion, and moved to the entrance. He pushed back the flap of ice he had sealed earlier, peering outside. The storm was still raging, the wind shrieking like a chorus of tortured spirits. Snow swirled in dense clouds, reducing visibility to almost nothing. It was a wall of white chaos, and somewhere out there, other cadets were likely suffering the same fate as the Lithoran, or worse. Eli's mind raced. He needed more fuel. The moss he had collected was gone, and there were no other immediate sources of burnable material nearby. But he still had the thermal fissure. The warmth seeping from the crack in the ice was minimal, but it was better than nothing. If he could expand it, maybe he could use it to maintain some semblance of heat. Grabbing his pickaxe, Eli shoved it through the loop on his belt and stepped outside. The wind hit him like a physical blow, slicing through his clothing and numbing his skin within seconds. His breath fogged the air in sharp puffs as he trudged through the snow, his eyes squinting against the blinding whiteness. Each step was a struggle against the wind, his boots sinking deep into the snow, but he pressed on, his jaw clenched in determination. When he reached the fissure, he dropped to his knees, his hands shaking as he yanked the pickaxe free. The crack was partially buried under a new layer of snow, the warmth barely noticeable now. Eli dug away the snow with his bare hands, ignoring the sting of the cold as he exposed the fissure once more. Warm air wafted up, carrying with it the faint scent of sulfur. It was weak, but it was there. Eli raised the pickaxe and drove it into the ice, chipping away at the edges of the crack. The sound echoed through the frozen air, each strike a dull rhythmic thud. Shards of ice flew in all directions, some slicing across his cheeks like tiny blades. His arms trembled with the effort, his muscles burning as he widened the fissure inch by inch. With each strike, more warm air seeped through, swirling around him in gentle waves. After what felt like hours, Eli finally set the pickaxe aside, his arms limp with exhaustion. The fissure was now wide enough for him to place the small pot directly inside, allowing the steam to rise and heat the surrounding area. It wasn't much, but it was something. Eli collected another handful of snow, packed it into the pot, and positioned it over the crack. Watching as it slowly began to melt, Eli straightened, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his glove. The wind howled louder now, carrying with it more faint voices. He turned his head, listening. Fallen. Can't move. Suit power critical. Someone, please. Eli swallowed hard, his throat dry. The voices were closer now, closer than before. Cadets were struggling, possibly dying, and the Academy's extraction teams had yet to arrive. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to take a deep breath. He couldn't help them, not yet. He had to focus on survival, on reinforcing the igloo, and keeping himself and the Lithoran alive. If he could make it through the night, maybe then he could search for the others. Maybe then he could do something. Eli turned and began the slow, painful trek back to the igloo. The wind screamed in his ears, each step a monumental effort as the snowdrifts swallowed his legs up to the knees. By the time he reached the entrance, his entire body was shaking uncontrollably. He stumbled inside, collapsing to his knees beside the Lithoran, who remained motionless against the wall. The fire had all but died, the last ember flickering weakly before winking out. The temperature plummeted instantly, the chill biting into Eli's bones like fangs. Eli pulled off his mittens and reached for the pot, lifting it from the fissure. The snow inside had mostly melted, the water warm to the touch. He poured a small amount into his flask, then moved to the Lithoran, gently lifting his head. The cadet's eyes fluttered open, his gaze glassy and unfocused. "Hey," Eli said, his voice low and firm. "Drink this." He pressed the flask to the Lithoran's lips, tipping it slowly. The cadet swallowed weakly, the warm water sliding down his throat in slow, agonizing gulps. Some of the color returned to his cheeks, and his breathing grew steadier, though still shallow. Eli set the flask aside and placed the pot back over the fissure, allowing more steam to rise and fill the igloo with its scant warmth. Eli sat back, his own chest heaving with exhaustion. His body ached from the hours of digging and chopping, his muscles trembling from the relentless cold. The Lithoran's breathing grew deeper, more even, his eyes closing as he slipped into a fitful sleep. Eli leaned his head against the icy wall, his eyelids growing heavy. But sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not yet. The igloo walls were thin, the wind still howling outside like a pack of ravenous wolves. If he didn't reinforce the structure soon, it would collapse under the weight of the snow, crushing both him and the Lithoran. Eli forced himself to his feet, his legs screaming in protest as he grabbed the pickaxe once more. He stepped outside, the wind tearing at his clothes, and began hacking away at the snow, shaping blocks of ice into more durable slabs. Each strike of the pickaxe echoed through the frozen expanse, the rhythm a steady, relentless beat. His breaths came in ragged gasps, his vision blurring as exhaustion threatened to consume him. But he kept going, block by block, building the walls higher, packing the seams tighter. Hours passed. The storm grew stronger, the wind screaming louder, but Eli didn't stop. His hands were raw and bleeding beneath the mittens, his body drenched in sweat despite the cold. The sky above remained a blank, endless sheet of gray, the light dimming as the day dragged on. Finally, with the last block in place, Eli staggered back inside, collapsing beside the Lithoran. The cadet still slept, his breath slow and even. The wound along his side now bandaged with strips of cloth Eli had torn from his own shirt. The igloo walls were thicker now, the structure more stable. The fissure continued to emit a faint warmth, the steam rising and filling the small space with the scent of damp earth. Eli leaned his head back against the wall, his eyes closing as the adrenaline finally began to fade. His body ached, his mind a fog of exhaustion, but for now the igloo held. For now they were still alive, and with any luck, they would make it through the night. But in the distance, beyond the howling wind, more voices echoed through the snow. A chorus of cries and screams, growing louder with each passing minute. Eli's eyes snapped open to the sound of distant screams. The igloo walls trembled as the wind outside roared with a ferocity that shook the entire structure. Snowflakes drifted through a small crack in the ceiling, swirling like tiny ghosts illuminated by the faint glow of the dying fire. Eli blinked, his heart hammering against his ribcage, his breath fogging the air as he tried to focus. The Lithoran cadet lay slumped against the wall, his crystalline skin covered in a sheen of frost. His chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths, the blue scarf wrapped around his torso darkened with dried blood. Eli leaned forward, pressing 2 fingers against the cadet's neck, feeling for a pulse. It was there, weak but steady. Relief washed over Eli, but it was quickly overshadowed by the urgency of the screams. Eli pushed himself to his feet, his muscles aching from the hours of digging and reinforcing. He moved to the igloo's entrance and unsealed the flap, squinting into the blinding white chaos. The storm had intensified, the wind shrieking through the canyons like a pack of wild, ravenous beasts. Snow whipped against his face, stinging like tiny needles, and the temperature had plummeted further, the air so frigid that each breath seared his lungs. The screams echoed through the storm, distorted and fragmented, but unmistakably close. Eli's jaw clenched as he scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of movement. The wind howled, carrying the sounds of struggling cadets, their voices muffled by the snow. Somewhere out there, others were fighting for their lives. and he was the only one close enough to reach them. Eli turned back to the Lithorian, his mind racing. The cadet was in no condition to be left alone, but if Eli didn't act now, the others would be lost to the storm. He had a choice to make: stay and keep the Lithorian alive, or go and risk both their lives for the chance of saving others. Eli sucked in a sharp breath, his jaw set in grim determination. He moved to the fissure, grabbing the pot of water he had placed there earlier. It was lukewarm now, the thermal fissure providing just enough heat to keep it from freezing. Eli poured a small amount into his flask, then moved back to the Lithorian, lifting his head gently and pressing the flask to his lips. "Drink," Eli said, his voice firm but calm. "You need to stay hydrated." The Lithorian's eyelids fluttered open, his silver eyes dazed and unfocused. He swallowed weakly, the water sliding down his throat in slow, painful gulps. Eli pulled back, setting the flask aside, and placed a hand on the Lithorian's shoulder. "I'm going to help the others," Eli said. "I'll be back. Stay here. Stay awake." The Lithorian's eyes drifted closed again, his breaths deepening as he slipped back into unconsciousness. Eli grabbed his pickaxe and pulled on his mittens, securing the scarf around his neck. The storm outside was deadly, the wind carrying shards of ice that could slice through fabric and flesh alike. But he couldn't ignore the screams, not when he was the only one capable of reaching them. Eli stepped outside, the wind slamming into him like a wall of solid ice. Snow whipped against his face, blinding him as he forced his way through the storm. The screams grew louder, more frantic, echoing through the canyons like the cries of the damned. Eli moved forward, his boots sinking into the snow with every step, his pickaxe gripped tightly in his gloved hands. The landscape was a white void, featureless and disorienting. The wind howled, carrying the voices of the cadets in broken, disjointed fragments. Held, trapped, can't move. Temperature dropping. Eli's pulse quickened as he followed the sound, his eyes straining against the blizzard. The snow swirled around him in dense clouds, reducing visibility to almost nothing. But then, through the storm, he saw it. A dark shape huddled against a rock formation, half buried in the snow. Eli stumbled forward, dropping to his knees as he reached the figure. It was a Xerian cadet, her iridescent scales dulled by frost, her limbs twisted at awkward angles. Her eyes were open, but they were glassy, unseeing. Eli pressed 2 fingers against her neck, his breath caught in his throat. Her skin was like ice, her pulse faint and fluttering beneath his fingertips. "Hey!" Eli shouted, shaking her gently. "Wake up! Can you hear me?" The Xerian's eyelids fluttered, a weak, pitiful moan escaping her lips. Eli wasted no time. He slid his arms under her shoulders and heaved her up, grunting under the weight. Her body was limp and unresponsive, her head lolling against his chest as he struggled to lift her. The wind fought against him, the snow pelting his face as he staggered back toward the igloo, every step a monumental effort. The igloo came into view, its silhouette barely visible through the storm. Eli gritted his teeth, his muscles burning as he dragged the Xerian through the snow. When he finally reached the entrance, he collapsed to his knees, breathing hard as he pulled her inside. The Lithorian was still unconscious, his chest rising and falling in slow, shallow breaths. Eli laid the Xerian beside him, grabbing the flask and pouring a small amount of warm water into her mouth. She swallowed weakly, her eyes fluttering as she regained consciousness. Eli pressed his palm against her cheek, feeling the icy chill of her skin. "You're safe," Eli said, his voice hoarse. "Stay awake. Stay with me." The Xerian's eyes focused on him, her silver pupils contracting as she nodded weakly. Eli set the flask aside and moved to the fissure, checking the pot of water. It was almost empty, the last remnants of melted snow clinging to the bottom. Eli cursed under his breath. The storm outside was growing worse, the temperature dropping rapidly. He needed more fuel. He needed more heat. And he was running out of time. Eli moved back to the entrance, his gaze fixed on the swirling snow beyond the igloo walls. The screams had stopped. The wind carried only silence now, a vast, empty void that stretched endlessly into the frozen night. But there were still cadets out there, still voices that had cried out for help, and Eli knew he couldn't leave them behind. He took a deep breath, his jaw clenched, and stepped outside once more. The wind hit him like a wall, the cold biting through his clothes as he trudged forward, his legs heavy with exhaustion. The storm raged around him, the snow blinding, the wind howling like a beast. Eli pressed on, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of life, any hint of movement. And then, through the swirling snow, he saw it. A dark shape lying motionless in the distance, half buried beneath a mound of snow. Another cadet. Another life hanging by a thread. Eli gripped the pickaxe tighter, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he moved toward the figure, his steps slow and labored against the relentless wind. The storm roared, the snow falling harder now, but Eli kept moving, each step a battle against the elements. The figure in the distance grew closer, its outline sharp against the blinding white. Another chance to save a life. Another chance to keep death at bay, and Eli refused to let the storm win. Not yet. Not when there was still life to be saved. Not when there were still voices calling out for help. The storm raged with unrelenting fury, its icy claws tearing through the frozen landscape like a beast on a rampage. Snow swirled in blinding sheets, and the wind howled with such ferocity that it drowned out all other sounds. Eli pushed through the tempest, his entire body aching, his vision blurred by the freezing wind. Every step was a battle, his legs dragging through knee-deep snow as he moved toward the dark shape half buried beneath a mound of ice. The figure was a Lithorian cadet, his crystalline armor shattered, shards of blue crystal scattered across the ground like broken glass. Blood stained the snow beneath him, the crimson stark against the endless white. Eli dropped to his knees, his heart pounding as he pressed 2 fingers against the cadet's neck. The skin was cold, almost lifeless, but there was a faint pulse, a weak but persistent rhythm that echoed in Eli's fingertips. "Stay with me," Eli muttered, his breath fogging the air as he heaved the cadet up, draping one arm over his shoulders. The Lithorium was heavy, his body limp and unresponsive, but Eli gritted his teeth and forced himself to stand, his legs trembling under the weight. The wind battered against them, the snow blinding, but Eli staggered forward, one step at a time. Each step a monumental effort. The igloo loomed ahead, its walls barely visible through the storm. The structure shook under the onslaught of the wind, snow piling up against the entrance like a barricade. Inside, the Zurian and the first Lithoran cadet lay huddled together, their bodies wrapped in torn blankets, their eyes half closed as they shivered uncontrollably. The fire had long since died, and the air inside was bitterly cold, the temperature dropping with each passing minute. Eli dragged the second Lithoran inside, collapsing to his knees as he eased the cadet down onto the icy floor. His own breath came in ragged gasps, his chest heaving as he fought to catch his breath. The Zurian's eyes flickered open, her silver pupils dilated and glassy. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a weak, rasping sound escaped her lips. Eli moved quickly, grabbing the flask and pouring the last few drops of warm water into the Zurian's mouth. She swallowed weakly, her eyelids fluttering as she struggled to remain conscious. The first Lithoran was still breathing, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths, but the second Lithoran was in worse shape. His crystalline skin was covered in fractures, blood seeping from multiple wounds as he lay motionless, his eyes closed, his body unnaturally still. Eli knelt beside him, his hands shaking as he pressed the flask to the cadet's lips. The Lithoran's lips were cracked and blue, his breaths faint and uneven. Eli tilted the flask, letting the warm water trickle down his throat. But the cadet's jaw went slack, and the water dribbled down his chin, soaking into the scarf wrapped around his neck. "Come on," Eli muttered, his jaw clenched as he shook the cadet's shoulders. "Wake up, stay with me." The Lithoran remained unresponsive, his eyes closed, his chest barely moving. Panic surged through Eli, his mind racing as he looked around the igloo, searching for something, anything that could provide warmth. The thermal fissure continued to emit a faint, weak heat, but it was not enough. The moss had burned out completely, and the fire was nothing but a pile of smoldering embers. Eli cursed under his breath, his eyes darting to the ceiling of the igloo. The walls were thin, the snow piling up on top, threatening to cave in at any moment. He had to act fast. He couldn't let the cadet die. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing the pickaxe and moving to the fissure. The crack was still emitting a faint warmth, but the opening was too narrow. Eli gripped the pickaxe with both hands, his knuckles white as he raised it above his head and brought it down with a furious strike. The ice splintered, the crack widening, more steam rising from the depths below. Eli struck again and again, each swing sending shards of ice flying through the air. The fissure expanded, releasing more heat, the warm air filling the igloo in a steady stream. Eli grabbed the pot, shoveling snow into it, and placed it over the fissure, allowing the snow to melt. He moved back to the Lutheran cadet, pressing his fingers to the cadet's neck once more. The pulse was there, but it was fading, growing weaker with each passing second. Eli grabbed the pot of water, now lukewarm, and poured a small amount into the flask. He lifted the cadet's head, pressing the flask to his lips, letting the water trickle down his throat. The cadet's eyes twitched, his jaw tightening as he swallowed, a faint moan escaping his lips. Eli's heart pounded with relief as the cadet's eyes slowly opened, his silver pupils unfocused but alive. "You're okay," Eli said, his voice shaking with exhaustion. "You're going to be okay." The Lithoran blinked, his gaze drifting to the other cadets huddled against the wall, their bodies pressed close for warmth. The Zurian was barely conscious, her eyes half closed, her breathing shallow. The first Lithoran lay motionless, his chest rising and falling in weak, uneven breaths. Eli moved to the center of the igloo, his legs trembling as he knelt beside the fissure. The steam continued to rise, the air warming slightly, but it was not enough. The cadets were slipping away, their bodies shutting down from the cold. Eli knew he couldn't save them all. He was only one person. But he couldn't give up. He leaned over the fissure, his eyes narrowing as he peered into the darkness below. The warmth was coming from deep underground, from the geothermal vents that ran beneath the ice plains. If he could widen the fissure further, maybe he could access more heat, enough to warm the entire igloo. But it was a risk. If the fissure collapsed, the entire structure could come down, burying them all alive. Eli clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around the pickaxe. He didn't have a choice. It was all or nothing. He raised the pickaxe, his muscles screaming in protest as he brought it down with all his remaining strength. The ice cracked, the fissure widening, more steam rising as the ground shook beneath them. The igloo walls trembled, snow falling in heavy clumps from the ceiling. Eli dropped the pickaxe, his chest heaving as the steam poured into the igloo, the air growing warmer by the second. The Zirian stirred, her eyes opening slightly as the warmth seeped into her skin. The Lithoran cadets groaned, their breaths deepening as the heat revived them. Eli collapsed to the ground, his body spent, his vision blurring as the adrenaline finally faded. The warmth filled the igloo, the steam rising in thick clouds, the air growing heavy with moisture. Outside, the storm continued to rage, the wind howling like a beast denied its prey. But inside, the cadets were alive. They were breathing. And for now, that was enough. Hours later, the storm finally subsided. The wind died down, the snow settling into a thick, heavy blanket over the landscape. Rescue shuttles descended from the sky, beams of light cutting through the mist as Galactic Academy medics rushed to the igloo, pulling the cadets from the structure one by one. Captain Zyler watched as Eli was carried out, his body wrapped in a thermal blanket, his eyes half closed as he was loaded onto a stretcher. The captain's gaze was grim, his jaw tight, as he looked down at the cadets lying on stretchers, their bodies bruised and battered, but alive. Later, in the medical bay, Eli awoke to the sound of voices. The cadets he had saved were gathered around his bed, their eyes shining with gratitude. The Zirian stepped forward, a flask of warm tea in her hands. She offered it to Eli, her silver eyes meeting his. "You saved us," she said, her voice trembling. "You